Good morning. I'm happy to start the first session in this conference, which is dealing with policy making. My name is Sanna Järvelä. I'm chairing this session. One of our aims in early strategy is visibility, and also an issue how we can contribute to the policy and the practice. How we can distribute our scientific information to the practice and help people to learn better, or the political decisions and the educational policy in general. We have invited 3 panelists who represent different issues in this team. Unfortunately, one of the panelists had to cancel in last minute. We have Brikena Xhomaqi, Director of Lifelong Learning Platform. We have Professor Debra Myhill, who is our President-elect, and we have Professor Jeroen van Merrienboer from Maastricht University. So welcome our panelists. EARLI wants to contribute to global learning challenges, especially those in the educational area. Therefore, we approached the panelists with the questions which are topical in terms of global challenges in general in our field. And we presented these questions to the panelists and asked them to pick up some of those which are relevant for them. The issues are dealing with multidisciplinary in our field and how it is needed for preparing our learners to the future work, for example. Digitalization in general, how is our current research information dealing with that, and how we can contribute with a better ongoing learning solutions. What is the dialogue in between policy making and educational science and how we can facilitate it? What is the relevance of empirical evidence in general for policy making? Whose responsibility it is to ensure that this information will be received by those who might need it? And should all academic research be useful in general at all? And also, what is the EARLI's role in this? The plan is that I will give a floor about 5 minutes per each panelist to express their arguments and opinions. And then we have something interactive for you. We know that the best minds are interactive minds, so therefore you will participate as well. And after that we have some time to discuss with the panelists, so be aware you have a chance to ask a question if you have. And also in the end we have a little session which is interactive with you, and that is to conclude. Some of the information we create here will be used later on among EARLI, and we will get this information to help our visibility in future. But now I would like to give a floor to our first panelist, Brikena. Brikena, welcome.
Thank you. Should I stay here? Or? Yeah? Yes, please. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be here today, and thank you, EARLI, for inviting my organization and myself to present the organization here. I'm impressed by the room, so I'm looking at you, and I was wondering how a selfie would look like together, but maybe we can do that later. Okay, so who I am actually, I'm the director of the Lifelong Learning Platform, so I'm actually wondering how many of you already know the platform. Can you raise the hands if you already have heard about? I see somebody over there. 1, 2, 3 people. It's okay, and 4, not bad. Okay, well, at least I won't say anything that you haven't that you have heard already, so I probably will be new to you. The Lifelong Learning Platform is a European umbrella organization that brings together over 40 European networks that represent different sectors of education. We tend to say from cradle to grave, an holistic vision of education, and also different forms of education. So we have in our membership European networks that represent the students, European networks that represent, for example, sport clubs, culture clubs. They are also considered learning environments. Schools, school heads, professors, teachers networks, scouts that you might know as well, and many different vet providers, training centers, adult education centers. So it's a very diverse network that represents these different forms and learning environments. So the formal education systems, the non-formal education providers, and also the informal education providers. So what do we do basically is to promote this holistic vision of education in EU policies. We are based in Brussels and we work with the European institutions. We are financed and supported by them as well in order to bring the voice of the learners and of the education and training institutions to the policymakers in order to feed their work and their initiatives. It's a tough job because, as some of you might know, education is not an EU competence, meaning that the EU can only do soft recommendations to the member states in terms of education and training. And therefore, our work is very difficult. However, there are many and various and a lot of different EU initiatives that are actually recommending modernization of education systems. There is also a lot of cross-sectoral cooperation and institutional cooperation, peer learning activities that allow the member states, together with civil society organizations that are based in Brussels, representing, among others from us, in order to progress and to work and reform education systems in Europe. At the moment, one of the hottest topics, of course, is the digitalization, digital technologies, how they're affecting education, but also the world of work. And the pressure on education is increasing, although, again, it's not an EU competence. But there was a huge step in 2018 when in the Gothenburg, the member states decided that the first pillar of the European pillar of social rights is access and quality education and lifelong learning for all, which means that at EU level we managed in a way to bring the attention to the education. And therefore the policymakers in the coming years have already set a few targets. These targets are very important because very often they come from an economical pressure, meaning that they require more efforts in policy in order to modernize and reform education to serve labor markets. While we as a European network representing civil society, learners, professors, and all the providers and the stakeholders in the education system, we tend to focus rather on the personal development of the individual and therefore reforming education systems to empower citizens. And in the digital context, one of the main issues that we see is the digital divide, that access to digital solutions is actually easier for those that already have basic digital capacities and competences. And therefore we are just increasing that divide if we don't tackle the needs of those that are more in need in this digital context. So the digital context is putting a lot of pressure on education and we are trying to work towards that. We had a position paper in 2017 about this very topic. One of the main points that we raised in that position paper is the need for more research, more cross-disciplinary research that will actually look at the impact that digital technologies have on the individual, on the institutions, on the teachers, on all the education systems and all the different aspects, being social, economical, psychological, etc. So for us, there is a lack of research in this regard. And the technology is moving much faster than the actual impact, than the impact that it's having, we were not prepared for. So we don't have research that can help us introduce the technology. We are introducing technology without that research and then analyzing the impact. So we have basically, I can say, a generation of sacrificed individuals that will be affected directly by this technology. Another point of our research was also the pressure that we have to provide evidence. We need to provide evidence for sure. However, we need to also have a common understanding of what we mean by evidence, because very often evidence for policymakers is quantitative data of how many people require this or that, or how many people have this or that capacity, rather than focusing on quality data and on individuals' needs and needs of individuals that are marginalized. So the risk of evidence-based data, if not qualitative, if not inclusive, if not involving citizens in the data collection, it's also another issue that we have raised in our position paper. And to finish because I guess we will have more time to discuss. Well, one of the points that we also raised in the position paper and that we raised in different activities is the need to work with stakeholders, the need of these EU networks that bring, like, for example, EARLI, bringing together all these individuals working in different research topics that are of your concern or of global challenge, responding to global challenges, is very important. We need more of these networks, we need more of these people coming together, because it's thanks to these occasions that we can bring more data, we can bring more evidence, we can bring more a better and a stronger voice to policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will continue with Debra. Welcome.
So I've chosen to pick up on 3 of the questions on that first slide. The first question was how and what kind of multidisciplinary research is needed to better prepare for future work and competences. And I think the first thing I would want to be stressing is the importance of interdisciplinarity. And I know that there's all sorts of problems terminologically, between trans, multi, cross-disciplinarity, and actually sometimes they're used interchangeably to mean the same things. But I would interpret interdisciplinarity as where there is an integration of research methods, perspectives, paradigms and methodologies, and that through doing that you're bringing to bear different lenses on the same theoretical or applied problem, and that as a consequence the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And I think one of the things about interdisciplinarity that's particularly good is that it can be disruptive and uncomfortable, because it pushes us out of very comfortable research silos that we might inhabit. And I think increasingly, certainly funding councils are looking more and more for interdisciplinary research teams to address some of the big issues that the world is facing. And I think there are questions for us as a community looking at education, looking at learning and instruction, to think, well, where do we fit in these? And if you take some of those big challenges, and you could name lots of them, but if you took, say, climate change, problems of migration, religious, racial tolerance, technology, safety, security. If you think about any of those big topics, there are roles for education and for what the research that we do on learning and instruction to inform the science of those different problems. And I think that's a really important thing for us to think about. I think then the other question I looked at was this one about whose responsibility is it to ensure that research reaches those who might use it? Well, I do think that we do, as a research community, have a responsibility. It's not, there are some critical comments I want to add into this as well, so it's not quite straightforward, but I do think we have that ethical and social responsibility to think about, with our research, why does this matter and to whom? I don't think that the answer to that always has to be that it matters to a very particular localized problem. It may matter to the way the field is developing its theoretical thinking, but I think the question's an important one to ask. And certainly with publicly funded research, I think there are also questions we have to think about how do we enable our non-academic users, non-academic beneficiaries to access our research. And so some of the issues around open access, I think, are very positive moves around allowing a broader set of people to access the work that we're doing. In England, we've already got as a requirement for any of our funded research projects from any of our research councils that we have to name explicitly the academic beneficiaries, and we have to present what's called a pathway to impact. Once we've done the research, how are we going to engage with users about that research? I did say when I was talking about responsibility that I'd also want to add some critical caveats. I am concerned if all research has to have impact. I think there is a real role for pure research, for theoretical research. I think there's also some problems with the concept of evidence-based research, and you slightly touched on that. In education in particular, very few things are so black and white that you can say this is absolutely the way to do it and that's wrong. But more than that, it's the way policymakers use evidence-based research. It's not always used intelligently, or it might if you're a politician. The chief scientist in England spoke to the British Educational Research Association a couple of years ago, where the academic community was challenging them to take more notice of the research. And he said very clearly, we are interested in evidence-based research, but only where it supports the policies that we want to present. And so I think, you know, that notion of an evidence-based research can serve other ends than really informing how we develop teaching and learning and future competences. But I also think we have to think a lot more about how we communicate our research beyond our own academic research communities and standard academic journals. What are the ways in which we might do that more? And I also think there's a real place for co-constructed research which bridges that interface between stakeholders and researchers, and that we both learn from those experiences. That as researchers we learn a lot by understanding some of the real-world problems that our stakeholders may be facing, but also stakeholders understand some of the rigors and disciplines of research that might alter the way that they think about the problems they're addressing. And then the third question that I addressed was, what's the role of EARLI in bridging the gap between research and policy making? And I chose that partly as the incoming president. It's partly going to be my responsibility to take some of today's discussion forward. So I think there are questions for us about how within our community can we develop more boundary crossing conversations. And I think you can interpret that notion of boundary in multiple ways. How do we encourage research and conversations that cross fields and domains? And we've just had a very interesting discussion in the SIG coordinators meeting about how do we encourage greater cross-SIG exchange and collaboration. But also, it's not just about within our research community, because the number of disciplines that we represent as a community will obviously be limited. How are we as EARLI connecting to disciplines way outside of our area, but where what we bring to the debate is interesting and valuable? So how do we connect with the scientists doing climate change about how we educate for changing behaviours? All those kinds of questions. Obviously, I think there's a role for EARLI in developing greater interdisciplinarity within EARLI. And I also think there are questions for us about how do we involve and engage with stakeholders beyond the academic community.
Thank you. And we would like to hear third panelist, Jeroen's ideas, so welcome.
Okay, thank you. My name is Jeroen from Merrienboer, and I'm an educational researcher for almost 40 years now. Currently working in the field of medical education at Maastricht University, which is very close by. I also took 3 ideas from the first slide, and I came up with some propositions I believe in. The first one, that single studies in education should have no practical or policy implications, only implications for theory. I'm a strong believer in the idea of Kurt Lewin, that there is nothing more practical than a good theory. And when we do studies, we may ask from these studies that they make theoretical contributions. And I also think that in educational sciences, we may require from our theories that they have practical relevance. But this doesn't mean that all our studies have practical relevance. It would be strange, and I think it would be dangerous. For example, I did quite a lot of research on worked examples, and many other people also did research on worked examples, comparing worked examples with problem solving and things like that. When you look at the studies conducted in the 80s and 90s on worked examples, and you had hundreds of those studies, 30 showed advantages of working with worked examples, 30 showed no advantages of working with worked examples, and another 40 didn't find anything at all. What would happen if we took these studies seriously? Each individual study. It wouldn't make any sense. The good thing is that because we had all these different studies, we were able to develop a theory. A theory showing that worked examples only work when they are designed in a specific way. Showing that worked examples mainly work for novice learners and not for more experienced learners. So we were able to come up with a theory of worked examples. And the theory has practical relevance, not the individual studies. And when we place too much emphasis on the educational relevance of individual studies, we are on the wrong way. Second, and that's a bit related, on evidence-based education. My claim is that there is no such thing as evidence in educational sciences. The whole idea of evidence-based education is a dangerous idea, and we should never have gotten into this trap. The basic, the idea of evidence-based education, and I'm sorry to say that, comes from the field of medical education. Because in medical education they have evidence-based medicine, and some people working in medical education came up with this idea in the late 90s that, well, we have evidence-based medicine, why not also develop evidence-based education? And when you look at the definitions of evidence-based education, it's typically something like, we should do good research, read randomized controlled trials. We should do good research in order to find the best educational methods. I've been doing research now for almost 40 years, and there are no best educational methods. It doesn't make any sense. Some educational methods work for particular goals under particular conditions. And often they only work in combination with other educational methods. So talking about best educational methods is dangerous and doesn't make any sense. What we need is theories explaining under which conditions and for which goals particular educational methods work and why they do not work. Of course, policymakers liked this idea of evidence-based method. And when I talk to policymakers, I explain them that this concept of evidence doesn't make any sense in educational sciences, and then they never ask me again, because there are many colleagues they'd like to talk with because they are claiming, well, I have evidence that this method works. For me, as a researcher, it's doubt that drives my research, not evidence. We should always doubt the theories we develop. We should keep asking questions. And it's not evidence that we are after. No, it's falsification of our theory so that we can further refine our theories. And I think that should be our message when we are involved in policy discussions. Trying to make clear to policymakers that there is no black and white, that there are no good methods and bad methods. But what we should aim for is a deeper understanding of the complex science that we are dealing with. An article I really liked was, I think, in the early 2000s, written by David Berliner, Educational Research, Why It Is the Hardest Science of All. And in this article, he clearly explains that there are so many interactions and so many complications in education that it really doesn't make sense to talk about evidence and evidence-based education. The best we can do is develop theories and models that try to grasp the complexity of the field. Well, maybe a final remark on this dialogue between educational practice and policy making. I think that is important. I think we should always be involved in this conversation. For me, it's not a dialogue, because the most important people to talk with are children and parents, our students. So we should always involve them in the discussion. The labor market should be involved, and policymakers should also be involved. And we cannot give the right answers, but we can help to bring in our understanding of the complexity so that these complexities can also play a role in policy making. Well, that's about it, I think.
Thank you, all panelists, very thought-provoking ideas. Now it's your turn. Next 5 minutes exercise, we want to hear your thoughts. Talk to your neighbor, 2 minutes. What you have heard from the panelists, and what do you think, what is the one most important issue EARLI should focus on in policy making? Log in to this Mentimeter using this, use capital letters, and write your idea down there. We will see them all coming soon there, but we will start right now, 5 minutes all. We'll continue with the panelists. They have been discussing here quite intensively, and I have seen many ideas on our screen already. Do you agree everything our panelists pointed out, or is there something you would like to add? Now it's your chance. We have a microphone there, so raise your hand. And you can also ask anything from the panelists dealing with this policy issue, but we will start with your ideas first. Phil, yes?
Hello, I'm Phil Winnie from Simon Fraser University in Canada. I was struck by Jeroen's complaint about using evidence, and I wanted to ask, which I posted to the website, should individuals seek to disconfirm their theories? I'm thinking about students and teachers. Or should they try to work on the best of the evidence they have, which is their history of personal experience?
Just to be sure, you are not asking this question with regard to researchers, but with regard to teachers and students?
Yes.
Students and teachers do a lot of other things than research. They can be doing research, but...
Well, perhaps I can qualify just a bit. Some may know I'm particularly interested in self-regulated learning, and my view is that people who are self-regulated learners are impoverished learning scientists. They don't have grants, they don't have research assistants, they don't have data analysis tools, etc., etc. So they do their research about how to proceed in life as best they can. And so in that context, I'm asking the question, should they base their next decision on evidence or try to disconfirm their theory?
I think it can be both. I mean, you can ask many questions when you are developing a model or a theory. And some of the questions might ask for falsification, some of the questions might ask for verification. And both can have their value. So I don't think this is doing one or the other thing. It can both play a role in theory development.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else there? Halska, please.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting statements. What I wanted to point out, that I had the feeling that between the first speaker, and I will not dare to misspell your name, so sorry, and what Jeroen said, there was a huge contradiction, because what I heard from the first speaker is that we are not fast enough to keep up with the speed of technological development, so you would know what to actually implement in educational practice. And what I distilled from what Jeroen said is actually the other way around. He kind of argues, no, take a step back and go back to develop better, newer theories, so we can make this, to make valuable conclusions for educational practice. So to me, this sounds like a real contradiction. So what shall we do? What to do now?
Brikena, would you like to respond?
May I first give a brief reaction? I'm not sure if there is really a contradiction. There should be a contradiction when you claim that because there are many new technologies, you should do research on these new technologies, which makes the research technology-driven. If that's the way you try to keep up with new developments, I think it's a dead end. But when you develop good theories that yield a deep understanding of the processes that are going on in education, these theories will enable you to incorporate new technological developments. So you can adapt, you can update your theories in such a way that the new technologies are included. So I think that a more theory-driven approach in education helps us to incorporate new ideas and to incorporate the use of new technologies. And then there is not really a strong contradiction.
You answered very well. I have nothing to add. You answered very well. But I mean, obviously, there is always a field contradiction in most of the things we say as well, because of the terminology. Yeah, I guess. But you answered very well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Up here.
Okay.
Hi. I'm Jan Willem Strijbels from the University of Groningen. And I was struck by Jeroen's comments, but also comments that Debra made. And they are sort of connected, in my view. The importance of theory is something that I absolutely share. And too often we end up confusing the results that we find and a string of results as representing theory, whereas it's actually the other way around, which was nicely explained by Cummings in a paper in 2000, that our theories should explain our findings. But then one thing, and that's the thing that Debra pointed out, and highlighting interdisciplinary research, and there was methods there, instruments, and so on, sharing paradigms. But it's also connected to theory. And one thing that I noticed is that we do very little, actually, is sit together and think about theory in an interdisciplinary manner. Because we can share all the methods that we have, and if we then reuse methods, at best it will be multidisciplinary in practice or in theory, because we keep using them in parallel. So the thing that we should work at least I would argue, is interdisciplinary theory development. So not just looking at theories in education, but also in psychology, also in other social sciences, and try and integrate them before we try to attempt to do interdisciplinary research, because otherwise we have no way of interpreting our findings. And I would like to hear what the panelists think about this.
Thank you. Debra, would you like to?
I think the issue of interdisciplinarity is one that is really ripe for further thinking about. I think that the point I made about we use different words for it and mean different things by it is still true. And even in the sort of the funding world, we haven't still fully sorted out what interdisciplinarity really means. So I think that would be a really good discussion for EARLI to go on taking forward within its community first, probably, and then in order to engage with those discussions beyond its community, because it's easier to say than it is to do. And I think that it's easy to do multidisciplinary research where you just get a research project with lots of different strands of the research coming from different disciplines. But I don't think that's truly interdisciplinary. And I think all the potentiality is in the interdisciplinary. But I think it's a difficult conversation that we still need to work on.
More questions? Please.
Thank you for a very interesting conversation. I just had a quick question for all panelists, actually. I really like the focus on theory building and that theory should drive what we do. But then how do we solve the tension between bringing theory to the policymakers and actually having the policymakers be able to do something with that actually affects practice?
Who's first?
Interesting question. Well, I think that my main point is that this idea of evidence-based education complicates our discussion with policymakers. So I think we should work towards a common framework that enables us to have a more fruitful discussion. As long as policymakers ask us for evidence that particular things work, I cannot see how this conversation can really contribute to improving the quality of our educational system. So I think this discussion with policymakers should be on a deeper, more fundamental level at the moment, so that we can develop a framework that enables us to have a more fruitful discussion. And I am very unhappy with all these educational researchers who actually try to deliver what policy asks from them, because that makes it easier to get funding and to have this conversation. But in the end, I don't think it will help us further.
I was going to follow up on that. I mean, I think if we think about policymakers in terms of politicians, I think it is very challenging. But I still think that we have that responsibility to at least attempt to educate politicians. I'm not very optimistic about the outcomes. Perhaps that's the consequence of having British politicians working for us at the moment. I've lost all faith. But I think it's important to think about policymakers at multiple levels, so that even at a school level, you might argue that teachers are policymakers within their classroom. And I think there is a lot more scope for. That's why I'm very keen on the co-constructed research. There is a lot more scope for working with people doing research together, where actually part of the process is that they are learning much more about that research, that the research question that they wanted a very clear binary answer to is going to come up with a much more nuanced, complex answer that raises more questions than you started with. But a lot of the work that we've done has worked with teachers in that way, and it's really constructive. But also we learn as researchers, so it's not all one way, that you're challenged by some of the things that you see happening or some of the things that are the way things are working, and that also informs the way you frame future research questions. So I'm more optimistic about the fact that we can get people to understand that complexity of educational research and evidence the closer you are to the activity itself. I'm less optimistic about politicians.
If I may add as well. We were actually discussing while you were also brainstorming and then putting on Mentimeter exactly this issue. And we ourselves as an organization, we found this difficulty very challenging, because we are asked on a regular basis by policymakers to show the evidence of whatever statement we make. We bring the voices of learners, individual professors, teachers, etc., our institutions. And every time that we do so, we do it through a collective democratic system of consultation with all these individuals and bring this to the attention of policymakers through recommendations or statements. We are always and continuously and increasingly asked, where is the proof, where is the evidence, where is the research about it? And every policy making at EU or national level is based on research that they fund for the purpose of that policy that they already have in mind. So we have no, we can't go back anymore. We are in this situation where the need and the request from policymakers for evidence is there. What do? I totally agree. We have to first educate them about how to use this evidence and what evidence we are talking about. But also, I really believe we need to, and there is way for the research and the work that you all do and your results to somehow feed that policy reflection. So make them reflect on different policy priorities rather than concluding on your results. So I think there is still a lot of work to do in bringing the world of academia and of research to closer to the policymakers. Because I was just saying that if you don't do it, they are going to find different ways of getting the data, which they are already doing. And I'm sharing it with you now. Most of the EU policy priorities, policy initiatives, they work this way. The European Parliament wants something on assessment methods. They open a call, finance a consultancy company based in Brussels or somewhere else to run a research with a sample that they can reach out, make some conclusions, and then they draft a policy recommendation, whatever policy initiative, and they say assessment methods should change this way because the research from this consultancy said that. So what do? Either we keep resisting and saying that we don't want to provide you with evidence because, as you argued, or we do something to actually avoid that they do it without us. So I think we are in a position where we have to find a way to speak to each other, educate them about what we do and what the purpose and how they can actually use it, because there is a lot of need for them to understand how they can make the best out of the research. Because the other risk will be that if we don't do so, funds for research and social humanities will continue decreasing.
I think we have still time for one or two questions. I think Erika was the first.
Yes, Erika de Vries from Université Grenoble-Alpes. So it's a very interesting discussion. I kind of agree with Jeroen that as researchers we should strive more towards the goal of increasing theory, and that then will help us find good solutions, but we're not solving problems, practical problems all the time. But I think a thing that I'm concerned about is this thing about evidence-based in itself, because we went from the first speaker who spoke about different kinds of evidence. Okay, we agree. To Debra, the second speaker, who said evidence-based research, which I think is a very dangerous thing to speak about that in education. To Jeroen, who spoke about evidence-based medicine and evidence-based education. I didn't hear evidence-based practice. The reason why I'm a little bit, I think it's risky, is as educational researchers, do we think that exists research which is not evidence-based? I mean, if we go and speak about evidence-based research, we're kind of I think it would be the only discipline to say that we're doing evidence-based research. So there's a danger in that, to say that in education there would be research without evidence. So this question about what is evidence and what can research bring, what's the status of a theory if we don't have hard quantitative evidence? So I would like to have your opinion on that.
I'll reply first, because I didn't mean evidence-based research. If I said evidence-based, I may well have done. But what I meant was policy making based on evidence from research. So yeah, I completely agree about what research wouldn't be evidence-based. I think that there's still a big debate about what counts as evidence, and then how the evidence is used, as we've discussed, because I think that is where there is a lot of risk, and that relying on one form of evidence, and even relying on one study, I think is very, very risky at policy level or even at professional level.
My solution is simply not to use the word evidence anymore. I think it's a term that's used in mathematics, but in social sciences there is no such a thing as evidence. We have theories and we have more or less support for these theories, and of course in educational practice they should work on the basis of theories that are broadly supported, but the word evidence is indicating something that we can never make true. I mean, there is no such thing as evidence in our field. Proof. Yeah, there is no proof. We prove things in mathematics, but not in social science.
We have a question there.
Thank you very much. My name is Labby Ramrath, and I'm from South Africa, way down in the south. So thank you very much for this engagement. I think we are actually engaging with that across the globe. So these things really trouble us a lot. I'm also from the South African Educational Research Association as well, and our upcoming conference is about all of these kinds of issues. But I just want to put on two things on the table. The issue around evidence and what is evidence, which is really troubling us in terms of how we inform and influence policymakers. And I think we really need to begin to tackle that from a range of perspectives, especially that of enlightening our politicians about what is evidence. And I think that's a big issue that we are, or a barrier that we are trying to overcome in order to influence policy making within our country. The second thing that I want to put on the table is that we talk about multidisciplinarity, but a whole lot of things are changing. Everything is changing, but we haven't been to really interrogate what is the current discipline and how they have come to be, with the view to actually introducing new disciplines and thinking about knowledge in a range of other disciplines that we haven't yet have come to realize.
Is there anything the panelists would like to react or comment?
I think you just raised relevant points, and we've been talking already about that nature of evidence. There's a debate to go on there, and the interdisciplinarity, I think there's a lot to be, I mean, even what counts as the boundary of a discipline could all be thrown up in the air. So I think there's a lot to discuss there to take that forward.
If I may, I think maybe we are focusing on evidence, but among the topics and the questions, you also had the digital context, right? So if we all agree that indeed evidence is very difficult for education and social science, then let's put it in the context of digital technology development and see if that is actually possible, because there is where multidisciplinarity also becomes increasingly more important, is where non-social science comes in through technologies. So I think if we make this discussion in the context of digital, then it changes slightly. So I just wanted to, and you kind of reminded me of this as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we will move now to the concluding section of this session, and this is what we do together. We started this discussion already yesterday in the Policy Council, and we collected some ideas which are already listed for you. Please find them in the Mentimeter again and rank those issues which you feel. Now we are talking about something to put this discussion to practice, and how EARLI can be responsible about these issues. There seem to be, this discussion is extremely timely in many sense, but there seems to be very many layers and levels and participations and interactions. But what is our role, and what we can, what are the practical, concrete issues we can progress in EARLI? Let's spend about 5 minutes to this exercise, and you will start seeing your voices soon in the screen. Okay, while we are collecting your ideas, we can see them there. I would like to give the final concluding idea for each of the panelists. And I would suggest that you will consider this issue, which is the most effective way to share our research with policymakers from your own perspective. Who would like to start? Okay, perhaps this time.
Yes, I would also agree with connecting with major national and international stakeholders is probably the most important way to open this conversation. First, I already indicated before that we should try to reshape this conversation. So organize this conversation in such a way that it is no longer about evidence, but it is about improving education on the basis of the understandings and the insights that we develop. And second, I think it's also important not to view this as a dialogue between educational researchers and policymakers, but to see it as a conversation of multiple stakeholders. So it's really important that we also include students and parents and the labor market and other parties in this conversation. I think I was quite critical on the role that policymakers fulfill, because they are often working from this evidence-based idea. But at the same time, I see the difficulties that policymakers are facing. And making policies in education is not only informed by educational research, but it's also informed by many other stakeholders. So in order to improve the quality of policy making, we should not think that as educational researchers we are the only or the most important stakeholder. Other stakeholders also need to be involved in this whole process.
So I think that one of the things that's come out of the conversation is that in this nature of connecting with stakeholders, it's not just about communicating and sharing research, but it's also about communicating the nature of educational inquiry. That's a key part of it. I think I'm agreeing with Jeroen when I'm also going to say that connecting with major international and national stakeholders is a very top-down approach. I think it's also really important to be connecting bottom-up, and that would be the parents and the children and the teachers, because I think that sometimes the power to make change is bigger that way than through the bigger stakeholders.
Thank you. I totally agree with both of you, and I would just actually say that from my perspective of the organization I represent as well, it's very important indeed what you just said, that the involvement of the different stakeholders it's key in all our work and in general in policy at all levels. And citizens' involvement in research is also another important aspect that we shouldn't neglect. And I think the connecting to different stakeholders, like it was chosen by you as well, it means to me more peer learning, more exchange, more cooperation with different organizations, different stakeholders, representatives of different groups of the society. And I think it's pivotal to all the work that you're doing, but also it's helpful to the work of all the others. So I really think that's where the key is, and breaking the silos. although we repeat that on a regular basis, it's never enough to repeat it. We need to break the silos. You shouldn't meet just between you, but also with all these other stakeholders. It's very important for you and for them. So that will be my last message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is excellent point to close this session, to break the silence and be as early community active, especially on this effort. Thank you very much for the panelists, your very provocative even ideas which are needed to stimulate this discussion. And thank you for the audience. We will take your ideas and proceed further those. This is something we have to work together in the policy making, and we will continue this policy making session. This is already tradition. We started in Tampere and have it now, and hopefully also in the next early conference. Thank you for coming and enjoy the conference.